Welcome to this webinar marking the International Transgender Day of Visibility, which was held on the 31st of March. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are broadcasting today. I'm broadcasting from the land of the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation. I pay my respects to the elders of the land, both past and present. I also pay my respects to emerging leaders. I attended a panel discussion yesterday by four First Nations women expressing their views about the voice to Parliament, and it was very thought-provoking. It's great to see strong emerging leaders. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar today or watching the recording. My name is Bridget Barker and I work in the Community Legal Education branch at Legal Aid New South Wales. Trans Day Visibility was started by an activist, Rachel Crandall, in 2009 as a reaction to the lack of recognition of transgender people, noting that only the well-known gender diversity-centred day was the Trans Day of Remembrance, a day of mourning. Transgender Day Visibility was created as a day to acknowledge and celebrate living members of the transgender community. I would like to acknowledge the tenacity, courage and diversity of the transgender and gender diverse people. I also want to acknowledge that today we are presenting this webinar in the context of very recent acts of hateful speech, vilification and violence directed towards the LGBTQ+ community. These events are deeply disturbing. Today's webinar will provide you and your clients with important information about the legal rights of transgender and gender diverse people when they experience discrimination and vilification. We will also send an email after the webinar with links to useful resources. This webinar will be an hour in total, including some time for questions and answers at the end. And you will also receive an evaluation survey, and we do appreciate your feedback. In today's webinar, we will be mostly referring to the law in New South Wales and to services available in New South Wales, as well as to some federal anti-discrimination law. If you are joining us from another state, the New South Wales-based laws will not apply to you. I will now introduce you to our presenters. I'd like to welcome Claire Williams, Assistant Community Engagement Officer from Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. Good afternoon, Claire.
Good afternoon.
And Eloise Brook, Health and Communications Manager at the Gender Centre. Good afternoon, Eloise.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We'll start the webinar with Claire presenting and Eloise will follow. Thank you, Claire. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to be talking today about transgender discrimination complaints in New South Wales in terms of Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, but I'm also going to mention some federal laws. Next slide, thanks. Oh, we're just having a bit of a tech issue. Just while we are, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work. We pay our respects to all elders past and present and to the children of today who are the elders of our future. Just today, just so you have general understanding, you'll be provided with a PDF after the seminar today, and you will have all the information I've said. So I'm not going to copiously talk through every slide. I'm just going to touch on them. And my amazing colleague, Eloise Brook from the Gender Centre, will have some more hands-on examples and is much more interesting to listen to than me. So yes, I'll just go on to the next slide. So we're just going to have a general discussion about discrimination today. Okay, so just in terms of federal legislation, I just wanted to touch on the fact that there are Commonwealth laws that cover the whole of Australia and they're administered by the Australian Human Rights Commission. So you might have heard about those on the news, or you might work in an area where you've helped clients make complaints to use the Australian Human Rights Commission. So they have a Human Rights Act, a Race, Sex, Disability and Age Discrimination Act, but it's important to say that their legislation is broad. It includes gender identity, intersex status, sexual preference, sexual orientation, criminal record, trade union activity, political opinion, religion or social origin. So it's much more broader than the current New South Wales state legislation. Next slide, thanks. But another federal law is the Fair Work Commission is an agency. It's an independent national workplace relations tribunal, and it's responsible for maintaining a safety net of minimum wages and employment. But in 2022, there was an amendment to the Fair Work Amendments, and there are specific changes relating to anti-discrimination and prohibiting workplace sexual harassment. So from December 22, you can make a complaint regarding breastfeeding, gender identity and intersex status also to the Fair Work Commission. But let's now talk about the state agency that I'm representing today, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. What do we do? Well, our Act was started in 1977. We strive to eliminate discrimination in New South Wales by answering inquiries. You'll be given our inquiry number at the end and on a PDF. So we answer inquiries about discrimination. If someone decides to make a formal complaint, we investigate and resolve complaints. These are all free services. We raise awareness about discrimination and its impacts. Doing sessions like we're doing today, we grant exemptions to the Act, particularly in terms of employment, and we advise the government about discrimination issues. So what is discrimination and how is it defined under the Act? Well, discrimination is when someone is treated less favourably because they have or assume to have a characteristic that's protected by New South Wales law. So in this case, it may be someone who's treated less favourably because they're transgender or someone assumes they're transgender. So here are the grounds, which are the types of discrimination complaints that we handle. These are all included in the Act. So we have disability discrimination, race, sex, pregnancy and breastfeeding, age, carers, responsibilities, homosexual, a transgender, marital or domestic status, infectious diseases, sexual harassment, vilification and victimisation. So the legislation is broad, but not as broad as the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the two different types of discrimination. So there are two types under the Act. That's direct discrimination. So I treat you unfavourably because of a characteristic you have, which I discussed before. But there's also indirect discrimination. So that might be a rule or requirement that, for example, an employer or an agency has or a service has that applies directly. It applies to everybody, but ends up unfairly disadvantaging people who possess a characteristic protected under the law, such as transgender status. And that would mean it would be not a reasonable rule under the circumstances. And I will give you a case example regarding transgender discrimination at the end. So we also cover different areas that the grounds may cover. So when is discrimination against the law? If it happens, most people think it's only if it happens at work, it's at work, but also when you're getting a job. Education, public schools, TAFE New South Wales and universities, where goods and services are provided, so shops, banks, even government services, and where accommodation is provided, for example, renting a house or a flat, also within registered clubs or any club that sells alcohol or has gambling machines. But just a little note on the bottom is that the ground of carers discrimination is only against the law at work, but all the others are covered in all those areas above. Specifically transgender discrimination. So transgender discrimination is against the law. It's when you've been treated less favourably because you're transgender or people think you are transgender. You're treated as your former sex when you are a recognised transgender person. You're forced to follow a rule or requirement as your former sex. You're treated less favourable because you're the relative friend or colleague of a person who's transgender or a person who's assumed to be transgender. So it's important to know that the law protects all transgender people no matter how they affirm their gender. Transgender vilification is something that's very important to mention, particularly in the current circumstances. So transgender vilification is against the law, and vilification is a public act that would incite hatred, serious contempt, or severe ridicule towards people who are transgender. Public acts can include communications that can be seen or heard by the public, print, radio, video, or online, signs, flags, or clothing that can be seen by the public, or distributing and sharing information. Now, it's important to say that there were over the last couple of years, there have been changes to some vilification laws. So serious vilifications provisions, for example, violence, under the Anti-Discrimination Act have been revoked and must be reported and investigated by the police. You can still make a complaint to us of transgender vilification with regard to those communications and t-shirts and so forth, but if it's regard to violence or for example, graffiti or damage, and you're not aware of who's actually done this act, then you would talk to the police. So there are some exceptions to the law. So when's transgender discrimination not against the law? So currently there's, if it's provided by a private education, employment in a private educational institution, or employment in organisations that have less than 6 employees. And it's not just transgender discrimination, it's a number of the other grounds as well. So sport, there's been a lot of conversations about sport recently. The Australian Human Rights Commission developed guidelines for the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse people in sport. They produced these in 2019. So it's unlawful to discriminate against a person who's transgender or presumed to be transgender, and this includes when playing community sport. No matter who you are or what your gender is, every person has the right to physical activity. But there are exceptions to the law in many professional sporting codes. And if you're unsure about this, make a call to our inquiry service, or you're more than welcome to ring the Australian Human Rights Commission. So lodge a complaint with us. A complaint needs to be made in writing. We're a free service. You don't need a solicitor. You can lodge a complaint in any language. Our inquiry officers are here to help. That's the most important thing. They're here to assist. And when you're making a complaint to us, you need to think of the following information. So why are you making a complaint? In this case, it may be transgender discrimination, but who treated you less favourably? You need to know that. You mightn't specifically know the name. It may be a shop, so you may be able to tell us a specific time, for example, in the shop, or the name of the shop, and so forth. The dates when the discrimination began, or the single date, and finished. So our complaints, when you decide to make a formal complaint, can be declined if it happened more than 12 months ago, but there is discretion. So there is a 12-month window to make a complaint to our service. But if you're unsure and you didn't know you could make a complaint to us, please still go ahead and make a complaint to our service. So the role of Anti-Discrimination New South Wales in complaint handling. So we investigate complaints of discrimination and try to help parties resolve complaints. We don't determine whether unlawful transgender discrimination has taken place. So we're neutral. We're not taking sides in the complaint. We don't act as an advocate for either party. So we try and assist both parties to resolve the complaint. We don't provide legal advice, but we can refer you to legal services or agencies that you may be able to get advice. And after the investigation of the complaint, AD New South Wales can, under the law, decline a complaint for a number of reasons, and most often that would be it lacks substance, that there was no substance found within the complaint. Okay, so how do we investigate? We send a copy of the complaint to the respondent, who's the person, the agency that you're complaining about, asking for a written response. The response is then the response is then sent to the complainant for comment. We decide whether to try and help the parties to resolve the complaint by conciliation. If conciliation doesn't always happen because the complaint may be declined, but when conciliation does happen, that's how we will remain neutral and we try to resolve the complaint. So a conciliation is meeting between two parties. Pre-COVID, this used to be face-to-face. It's mostly online now, facilitated by a conciliation officer. We'll never put you face to face with a bully. So normally when you make a complaint, it's representatives of the organisation that you're complaining about who would participate in the conciliation. It's not necessarily the person that you're making the complaint about. Conciliation is used to try and help parties resolve complaints, and complaints can be resolved even when parties do not agree on what happened. Conciliation may be a conference online or a telephone at the moment, and each party gets to have their say. Parties may request to have legal representatives, but they don't necessarily automatically have them. And we suggest that people have advocates or support people at the conference. There may be joint sessions and private sessions with the person making the complaint and so the complainant and the respondent, the agency that you're making the complaint about. So what are some of the potential outcomes? So we ask people when they're ringing the inquiry service is if they decide that they're going to make a formal complaint, that they probably need to think about how would you like this to be resolved. So it can be an apology or a statement of regret. It's important to say AD New South Wales doesn't decide how the complaint is resolved. You making a complaint have to tell us how you'd like it to be resolved, and the other party has to agree to that. So again, it may be an apology or a statement of regret, a job reinstatement, a transfer or promotion. It may be compensation, financial compensation, access to a previously denied job or opportunity, workplace education and staff training regarding discrimination, or a change in a workplace policy. There's many more outcomes as well as those ones. So what happens if the complaint isn't resolved? You as the complainant may request a referral to the New South Wales Civil and Administration Tribunal, which we call NCAT, even if the complaint has been declined by our service. But the complaint can be withdrawn if you're making a complaint to our service or to NCAT at any time without penalty. Here's a case study. It's important that we show you. So here's an example. Our complaints are confidential, so we will never tell you the name of the person that made this complaint. So this person's name's been changed. So once someone's made a complaint and it's resolved with us, it's a confidential conciliation, and it's not kept on your work record or anything like that. So case study is Kayleen's story, transgender discrimination at work. So Kayleen's proud of her transgender identity. She worked in retail and did her job well, maintaining a positive performance record. She often received praise from customers and a supervisor for her service. But she'd engage with curious customers if they initiated friendly conversations with her surrounding her transgender identity. And when this was discovered by Kayleen's employer, she was counselled for speaking openly with customers. She received a negative performance review at the end of her probationary period. Kayleen was later terminated. Kayleen felt she had to hide who she was at work, which caused her mental health to suffer. She lodged a complaint of transgender discrimination with our organisation, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. During the conciliation process, her employer denied that Kayleen's termination of employment was linked to her transgender identity. However, they sympathised with Kayleen and agreed to provide her with employment references and assistance with job seeking, and also the employer also agreed to pay compensation. So a monetary payment, which was accepted by Kayleen. So Kayleen just accepted that at the end, and that resolved the complaint. Next slide, thanks. So just in terms of contacting us, if you wish to make an inquiry, there's the 92685544 number there and the 1800. You're more than, if you actually do go online to antidiscriminationnewsouthwales.gov.au, one of the first slide that comes up is about making a complaint. There's a button and you're able to press that to make a complaint. If you don't want to use our online complaint form, you can simply email the complaint using complaintsadb@justice.newsouthwales.gov.au. If you do have any questions about this, obviously you can email these to Legal Aid, post this, and we'll try and answer them during this seminar. If we're unable to do that, feel more than welcome to ring inquiries or complaints to resolve some of your questions, or you can email me direct under the email address that's there. Thank you so much for your time. There is our email address, which You'll be provided this on a PDF. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we have a monthly newsletter called Equal Time you might want to follow as well. Thanks so much for your time, and I'll pass you on to our other amazing speaker, Eloise.
Thanks. I'll hand over to you now, Eloise.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just setting up ready to go. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, that I'm meeting on, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Always was and always will be traditional ownership, land of the traditional owners. Thank you very much for Legal Aid Australia for having me speak today. So I am Eloise Brook. I'm the Media and Communications Manager for the New South Wales Gender Centre. We are an organisation that is celebrating its 40th year this year. We think that we're the oldest non-stop trans service running in the world. We're still waiting for someone to tell us that this is not the case. But while we're waiting, we'll keep saying it. We certainly have been going the longest in Australia, and we come out of this strange kind of circumstance where support and funding in New South Wales for the trans community and the basis of an organisation like the Gender Centre comes from a time when trans and gender diverse people did experience obvious discrimination, systemic discrimination, abuse and violence. But we weren't front page news each successive month since approximately February last year. How things have quite changed. So having been around for such a long time, or a considerable amount of time, we have some interesting kind of perspectives, and we are and remain an organisation that is led by members of the community. So that, on top of the frontline services that we provide, give us a really good insight into what's happening. Next slide, please. So today, I'm mindful that we have a limited amount of time. I'd like to kind of touch on a few topics. Obviously, I am coming from a different angle than Claire's speech, which was fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire. And I'll be more focusing on the service that we provide, the community that we look after, and some examples of what the community is actually experiencing in 2023. And maybe some kind of things to think about in terms of the areas that we most need support in, but also keeping in mind, if you are working with trans and gender diverse people and or families as well, the kinds of concerns and issues that they are going to bring in or be talking about, and even their state of mind when they're doing it. So thank you. Next slide. That's great. So I mentioned the GC has been around for 40 years, and predominantly we started off as an accommodation service, crisis accommodation, and have expanded into almost all areas that concern the health and well-being of trans and gender diverse people. That includes crisis accommodation, but also things like mental health support, resilience building, being able to access counselling services, being able to link in with groups, and also particularly for our most disadvantaged sections, we have social work and case management, because the issues that concern the community don't tend to be one-off kind of things. They tend to be a cascade of events. Discrimination for trans and gender diverse people frequently looks like a combination of homelessness, mental health concerns, drugs underemployment, which means that if we aren't reaching out and supporting across a range of services, then we aren't going to be able to do our job properly. In the last 10 years in particular, for all sorts of reasons, we've seen an increase in support required by trans and gender diverse young people, and trans and gender diverse families. And I will talk about families and the framing of young people in that context a little bit later as I talk, but they are now or increasingly a very important part of the services that we are providing in New South Wales. So I think if you could, next slide, please, that would be great. So I think I'd like to start off by perhaps giving a, so here are some stats. Let me just make sure we're on the same. Yes, fantastic. All right. So here are some interesting stats just to think about as we're kind of talking about this. Numbers wise, we think that maybe at least 1% of the population in New South Wales identifies as trans and gender or gender diverse. But we think that this is much greater. I think that we've seen an increase in people feeling like they can come forward and express themselves. And some more recent studies can often put these stats as high as, you know, upward of 7, 8, or even 9% when you include broader definitions of how gender works. We found out that we provide 90% of the trans-Pacific services in New South Wales. So I think it's why we're so tired all the time. There's also some other figures about the kinds of episodes of service that we do. So my first example of a case study, and I think this one goes to the heart of the kinds of experiences that trans people experience. Usually what we have is a trans and gender diverse young person or a young adult who is maybe either living at home, but most likely are living on their own. They access all the same kinds of services that everybody else does. And they also, you know, are online and engaged in that way. The experience that the trans community frequently has happened to them is that the discrimination that they come to face has an eroding effect upon mental health and resilience. So if you have a trans person, perhaps a trans woman who needs to go to visit her doctor, visiting her doctor means that she has to leave her house. She has to prepare herself mentally, psychologically, for perhaps the kinds of discrimination that she will experience. That is most likely, or it's least likely to be an overt act of violence, although it's not out of the question. And it's more likely to be the case where perhaps she's sitting at the bus stop waiting to catch the bus, and someone is sitting near her, staring at her too much, or staring at her in a way that she finds uncomfortable. Perhaps when the bus finally comes, the bus driver might, intending to be friendly, might use her wrong pronouns or misgender her in terms of identifying her as male. When she gets onto the bus, she might be looking for a seat. Someone might move their bag in the way, or people again might be staring. So all of these kinds of experiences build up over time, and all of us as human beings experience things like this, where we have someone look at us strangely or are rude, and we generally have the kinds of resilience in place to allow us to process this and to move on. But the one thing for the trans community is that we are, or trans people are, experiencing these kinds of microaggressions and these small discriminations on a not only just a daily basis, but on an ongoing daily basis. And over time, even the most resilient of any of us begins to be worn down by the kinds of unpleasant experiences. So our trans woman has caught a bus, perhaps she's gotten off at the other end, and perhaps she's already feeling an increasing sense of anxiety and upset about what she's experienced, which for those people who engaged in them, they might not see that as being somehow a form of discrimination or see it in any way as being aggressive. But that's not the way it's frequently read for trans people. They might finally arrive at the doctors, and there might be the receptionist who is incredibly busy, checks their notes, looks up and then says something along the lines of, how can I help you, sir, or any of these kinds of things. And this might be the moment when our trans woman finally has reached breaking point, and she might get really angry or frustrated. She may storm off. Maybe she'll sit and she'll glower in the waiting room. So what then happens is that every single day that our example trans person has to go to the shops, has to go to the doctors, has to catch public transport, or any of the 100 or so things that we all do in our day-to-day, they are accounting for the kinds of discrimination, the kinds of experiences that they are going to want to avoid. And that leads them to making decisions about whether they step out their door. Do I actually need to go? Do I actually need to be to leave my house and face the prospect of someone wrecking my day on top of, cascading other kinds of feelings of depression? So they might find themselves becoming frequently isolated. Perhaps they turn to, social media as a source of engaging with other people, and find that is probably an even worse scenario. So then what this picture that we get, especially around our trans women, although it's true of trans men, is the erosion of self-confidence, the erosion of mental health, and the erosion of resilience that leads to staggeringly high rates of attempted suicide and suicide ideation as well, and not to mention depression. So we do know that between the ages of 12 and 24, trans and gender diverse young people are 48.1% likely to attempt suicide. So that's 20 times the national average. So, which is an absolutely shocking kind of figure. And I'll return to that figure when I'm talking about families, because as you can imagine, families and parents are particularly anxious about what's happening. So I think it's, I've taken the time to talk through an example or a case study of what you might, of that kind of internal or not so internal life of a trans person, because as a service provider when and if you are engaging with trans people, when you're thinking about how to support that family in your roles, whether you're thinking about the kinds of cases or the kinds of discrimination that they might experience, it's really important to understand that and I'm sure that all of you do, that nobody arrives sitting in the seat in front of you as a blank slate. They bring all these sorts of traumas and limited capacities with them when they arrive. So more, I think, a particularly relevant location or a kind of site to talk about in many ways is when trans people try to access health. So all the things that I've talked about are particularly relevant. But in the case of seeking appropriate or adequate or health care for trans people, this is one of the worst places, or this is the site where all of the things that I mentioned before kind of come together to mean that trans people aren't seeking appropriate care. They are, instead of going to a doctor's, perhaps they're ending up at an emergency department. And if they are turning up at an emergency department, it's usually because something's gone really wrong. Their health is at a critical or an acute stage. And if they don't turn up at the hospital, at the emergency, then there are significant things that are going to happen to them. So the experience then is again compounded by misunderstanding, high levels of stress, and a health system that frequently fixates on gender. With a lot of moves, a lot of things have been, steps have been taken to improve, but this is still an area where trans people experience discrimination. So as a second case study, I frequently work with nurses and healthcare providers, because they are frontline service, and they are always, I guess, the stories that we hear and the community feedback really is about their experiences with nurses And fortunately, those experiences are really, really good. So I've kind of given you a negative story. The positive story I'd like to kind of share to kind of balance this up is an example of a young trans woman who, for all sorts of reasons, ends up in the emergency department and has to stay overnight. And while she's staying there, her family comes to visit her or finds out that she's there. And the nurses, the nurses are put into a position where that this is their patient, but they're hearing that the family is referring to this young trans woman using what we would call their dead name, the name that they were assigned at birth, but they have changed, and referring to them by using pronouns that don't reflect their chosen identity. So in this instance, one of the fantastic stories that we have to share or we bring back is that in this instance, we had this young person visibly distressed in a place where their healthcare was the primary reason that they were, and being surrounded by family. And the nursing staff were concerned about what they could do. And so what they did do was that when they were engaging with this trans woman and with her family, they were using her chosen pronouns. They were using her name, even when it contradicted the family's own preferences. Now we're talking about an adult here. Obviously, working with young people is a different situation, but the effect that nurse or those nurses in making that decision had upon the outcome for that young trans woman was significant. The idea that she felt supported, that she felt in that space, that there was a nurse or there were staff that were respecting her and were even able to kind of in many ways show her family the level of acceptance around her identity. These kinds of instances of kindness or respect, use of pronouns, the use of correct names, are incredibly valuable to trans people. So this is an example of a young trans person in hospital, but we also see the same thing when trying to access GP service. Again, I gave you an example of of a trans person who experiences dead naming with an overworked receptionist, but we also hear the stories about doctors who understand the importance of getting it right and respecting identity of their patients, and finding that their trans and gender diverse patients and clients are incredibly receptive and grateful for that support. So next, after that, I'd like to give me a second while no, actually, if you could go back to the case studies, I'd appreciate that, the previous slide. So I've outlined some of the examples. I've talked about case studies. I think it's also worth mentioning where we currently are in 2023 and at the beginning of April of 2023. I was very fortunate to give a speech or a talk like this to the Anti-Discrimination New South Wales for Claire. And I was commenting just this morning how significantly different the issues that we had talked about at the beginning of February were to what we were talking about at the beginning of April. So in the last while, and certainly in the last 2, if not 3 weeks, we've seen an explosion of focus on trans and gender diverse people, an explosion of focus on trans health and young people, even to the point, as we are all aware, that we've seen national and international headlines. Now, this has continued on since the federal election of 2022. It hasn't really subsided that much. We got a bit of a break during Pride, but even then, that was only a very small kind of reprieve. None of us expect it to go away or to change significantly in the future. But I guess it's worth kind of pointing out some of the main themes or ideas that we're experiencing or having discussions about, within the community per se. So one of the main issues that we have one of the main concerns is the unrelenting amount of media focusing on trans and gender diverse people right across the board. We have been very fortunate in that there have been some media organisations that have taken up the support of trans people in reaction to what they're seeing. But on the whole, as I mentioned, that the trans community represents 1% of the wider Australian population. And yet, if you were reading the newspaper, you would perhaps think that we represented a much more significant number and were a much more significant threat to the wider Australian community. This unrelenting media barrage that has been going on for so long has a terrible effect on the mental health of trans and gender diverse people and their families as well. So we're very fortunate in Australia in many ways, because the media and the negativity that we get is predominantly sourced from the UK and from America, where laws are significantly different. We are very fortunate in Australia to have the kinds of anti-discrimination legislation in place. It's not perfect, of course, and there's lots more work to be done. But trans and gender diverse people and their families can at least have understand that we have the basics in place. But we often see the way that the media frames the conversations that they are wanting to have as if this was still an ongoing conversation, as if that in play in the media and in Australian society, a discussion about the legitimacy of trans people, a discussion about the legitimacy of trans people's healthcare was still somehow ongoing and something that needed to be addressed or reformed. Unfortunately, in places like New South Wales and Victoria, because of the work of a lot of the community organisations and advocates, we are in a very fortunate situation where we are seeing things put in place. The New South Wales health strategy, LGBTQI health strategy, is one of the best in the world. And so there's often this kind of disjoint, but that's not to say that, especially for trans and gender diverse young people and who are out there in the suburbs with their families who are not accepting of their gender diversity, this constant barrage from the media creates an environment of intolerance and also an environment of violence. I'm just going to cough. So I apologize for that. That's why it's really important that we continue to monitor and engage with the media to bring this kind of level, these topics, these issues around trans people that don't really exist down like quite a significant number of notches. So one of the key arguments, and we saw this in the last week and a half with Parker Posey, the UK advocate activist who came out with an argument about the way that trans women's existence, trans women's inclusion in basic services and in community organisations such as sport is a threat to the existence of trans women, to a threat to the existence of fair sports. And again, these are all based upon arguments that are not supported or backed up. So, you know, there's a whole conversation about the nature of sport that is for a longer kind of conversation in a different space. But in Australia, for example, about a decade ago, the Australian sports community sports sector realised that there was they had a significant problem with numbers. The traditional idea of what sport was, which was you know, a men's game focusing on young men and was exclusive of women and the LGBTQI community, meant that there was a reduction in people taking up sports and families taking up sports. So Sports Australia and other kind of bodies within the context of Australia did their research and you know, opened up codes, were inclusive of gender diversity, were inclusive of LGBTQI plus people. And so over the last decade, in Australian community sport, which makes up at least 90 to 95% of in the entire sport in Australia. The existence of trans young people and trans kids has been not even an issue, for the last decade. So it's not until we start to pick up stories from America and from sporting bodies overseas that there's suddenly all this contention about sport. But one of the reasons that the trans community has been so vocal or adamant about our inclusion in sport is that the mental health and the physical benefits of including everyone within sport is really, really important. And I guess the last thing to say about that really is to point out that that when we watch elite level athletes in sport, we're watching the 1% of the 1%. And so young people need to be able to access, minority groups need to be able to access the benefits of community sport. So I guess in the remaining kind of little bit of time that we have, I'd just like to kind of mention one of the most disadvantaged section of our community, I think, or one of the most focused on are our families, our trans and gender diverse young people and families. At the GC, we look after about 900 families through a larger online kind of community, but we provide somewhere around about 350 to 400 instances of casework for families across New South Wales. I did warn Bridget that I would jump all over the place with my slides. So Bridget, if you could go to the next one, that would be great. Fantastic. So, I'd like to kind of give you within a couple of minutes, just the idea that our families are really struggling. It's one of the areas that we need to continue to work on. We're seeing violence in schools when our political leaders speak across the board and they speak negatively about trans folk. We see that translated to violence within the schoolyard. And there are some stories, some shocking and unfortunate stories about the increase in violence towards trans young people in those sites. It's been the case over the last little bit that even in a country like Australia and New South Wales, where we've seen an increase or an improvement to services and to the rights of trans people, we're still caught in a situation where, for instance, if you have a school, and if at that school you have a supportive headmaster or vice or teachers, then those trans young people, they're set, they're fantastic. But the flip side of it is if you have a school where you have an unsupportive school body or unsupportive headmaster or any combination like that, then it suddenly becomes living hell for the trans community. And broadly across the trans community, we see this repeated. We have allies, we thrive. Where the allies don't exist, we suffer. So for families, they're at crisis point. The attempted suicide rate I mentioned is 20 times the national average. Families are frequently spend years on suicide watch. During COVID, the Gender Centre oversaw somewhere around 40 to 50 families who were on suicide watch, and we didn't lose any of them. But that is a credit to the families who often go for years with one parent having to reduce work, having to be present, having to keep an eye on their young people. Family breakdown is significant. And so when we throw in the media stuff on top of this, we see that we have a crisis of support for young people and families. 8:55 a.m. and 3:15 p.m. in the afternoon are our most significant moments when we're dealing with crisis, especially around young people facing bullying. The last thing I'll say about this, though it ties into everything, is that is that young people and families experience violence, and in doing so, they close their doors and are not open to discussions, are unlikely to report the instances of discrimination or violence. Often are led by a child's desire to not stick out or to be shown or to be visible. Families will experience some kind of violence and then will simply either move schools or withdraw, but rarely do they put in complaints. And this is something significant that we need to do something about. I'm going to leave it there. I could keep talking. But I think to summarize, the purpose of me speaking, or the importance of what I'm saying, is to, I suppose, give that perspective of who your clients are, what they are thinking about, the kinds of stresses and discriminations and lack of resiliences that they're experiencing in their day-to-day lives, and how that might lead them to visiting you at Legal Aid. So thank you for hearing me today.
Thank you so much to both Eloise and Claire for your presentations. We've got time for questions now, and Claire, we do have a question addressed to you that came in earlier. The question is, why is there an exemption for trans discrimination for workplaces where there are 6 people or less?
So the exception is just based on the fact that when the law was written, it was written in that manner. So it's not if it includes disability, it includes all the grounds as well in where there are less than 6 employees. So indeed, there has been a promise by our new state government that our Act may be rewritten and be updated. So there have been very few changes made since 1977. So watch this space that our Act may be updated.
Thank you. That's the only question that we have currently. I wondered, Eloise, is there anything else that you wanted to speak to in the little bit of time we have left?
Well, yeah, I guess, I mean, just to underline what I've said, you know, that the trans community, whether that's, you know, across the age range, whether that's young people, their families, or the wider community, are less likely to seek, you know, are less likely to end up in or seek any kind of aid or help. I've mentioned health, but it's true of something like legal aid as well, until things are so significant that the level of distress is very high. But I think it's the one thing I can impart to listeners today, working in this space, is to support the community as best you can, is to keep in mind that level of trauma that they're bringing, that lack of resilience. But as I say that, you know, like, I'm sure people are going, well, that sounds like every single client that I see every single day in the legal aid space. And, you know, so it feels like it's important to explain more clearly, I guess, as to why that level of stress and strain exists. But I would have to acknowledge that, yeah, I'm sure that people are not turning up to legal aid, you know, with options anyway. So, yeah.
Thank you. And thank you both for your case studies. I think they were a great way to share with our audience the experiences of transgender and gender diverse people. And I think it's through those experiences that you can best get an understanding of how to best support your clients that come to you. It's just a couple of more questions.
Yeah, I could. So, still unclear about transgender sport for school-aged children. Is there further reading you could recommend? So I'm not sure what that means. I mean, you can't discriminate on, you know, you can't discriminate within within community sport. A young person is able to access sport and is able to play in the gender that they identify with, but it's important that, you know, we often come up with these constructions about what that means. Are we seeing you know, a 14-year-old who is 6 foot tall coming in and injuring everyone? It is one of those kind of worst case scenarios. And if you think about sports in the 80s and 90s, you think about the sporting codes in 2023, there is so much due diligence put on every aspect of sport in Australia. So at the community sport level, and I've been involved in community sport through my children for years, if a kid of any shape or size rocks up to play in any kind of situation, then there's a serious, then any kind of sporting code or is required to assess whether it's appropriate that person be able to play. Nobody is, you're not seeing giant children playing small children, and that's got nothing to do with gender identity. Like the idea is that, sport, the purpose of sport is to build a community, to instill young people with the skills that they need to be able to kind of like go on and live their best lives, and the sporting field is a great place to do that. So there's little or no opportunity to discriminate, except of course that, and then I'll stop. Of course, any sporting code or any kind of sports field where you have parents or a group of parents perhaps who are not accepting is going to lead to anyone who's being discriminated against walking away, and less likely to have that person or that family, if they're trans, to lodge any kind of discrimination.
Did you have anything to add, Claire?
No, I just agree with everything Eloise said. I just would suggest that when you get the PDF, you have a look at the guidelines that the Australian Human Rights Commission established in 2019. And if you've got any questions regarding those guidelines, as our agency didn't write them, talk to the Australian Human Rights Commission. But if you do have issues surrounding your children playing community sport, feel more than comfortable to ring our inquiry line or make a complaint. Mm-hmm.
And just to let everyone know that I will send a PDF copy of today's presentation by email following the webinar today. It doesn't look like we have any further questions. Just a lovely thank you there for the talk, so we can end right on time. So I'd really like to thank Eloise and Claire for participating in the webinar today and sharing this information with us and our participants. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Bye, everyone.